quick question. Does Andy Lau ever age? Because I swear that guy, whatever he's drinking or eating, can I order some? Because this guy does not age. And I just want to say,
he's the Chinese Paul Rudd, basically.
Yeah, he is the Chinese Paul Rudd.
Hello and welcome to Deep Dive Movie Reviews with my friend Steve Hackman and myself, James Marsh. This episode, we are talking Frank Guo's The Wandering Earth 2.
Hey, you know the drill. If you haven't already subscribed to Deep Dive Movie Reviews, it'd be a great favor to us if you went ahead and did so. Just go ahead and hit the subscribe button. While you're there, just ding the little bell, and that way you're notified when a new video drops. And just as a reminder, Deep Dive Movie Reviews does contain spoilers, so you've been warned. James, let's talk Wandering Earth 2.
Okay, so yes, The Wandering Earth 2 is a prequel to 2019's The Wandering Earth, a huge Chinese sci-fi blockbuster, which I think is ranked the fifth most successful Chinese movie of all time at the Chinese box office. That film was inspired by or adapted from a short story by Liu Cixin, who is arguably the most successful, certainly the most famous internationally, sci-fi author in China. He's best known for The Three-Body Problem, which is a novel that won the Hugo Award, and I think it's the first time that a sort of Chinese writer won that big sort of international award, and that brought him to international acclaim. As far as I'm aware, The Three-Body Problem is being adapted by the Game of Thrones guys for HBO or Apple or one of them, and suffice to say, this movie was the first movie was such a big hit that they're like, right, we need more, but we can't really do a sequel, so let's do a prequel. Liu Cixin is on board as an executive producer and a story consultant, certainly helped develop this idea. It takes place decades before the events of the first film and spans decades and really kind of takes you right up to the point where the first film begins. Essentially, the premise is that the sun is dying, and as it's dying, it's expanding, and it's going to consume the solar system and the Earth along with it. And so the powers that be globally come together in an effort to try to come to some conclusion as to what the best plan is. They've got various ideas. Now, we know, obviously, because this is a prequel, that what they will eventually hatch upon is called the Wandering Earth Project, where they will they will create thousands of sort of rocket boosters around the world that will propel the Earth out of its orbit on a 2,500-year mission into another orbit, many obviously light years away. And in doing so, obviously the whole global population has to come together, and they will take shelter during this process in deep underground cities. So you've got this weird situation where everybody fighting for this cause knows that they will not benefit from the result of it, but they're doing it for future generations, and therefore the whole thing is a big climate change allegory. It's you make sacrifices now so that future generations will benefit. And obviously there are some people who feel that that's important, and there are other people who feel, nah, I'm just going to make the most of my time. And that's kind of basically it, I think.
Summed up very well, James. Yeah, this is one of the highest concept films I've watched in a long time. I mean, the premise is so absurd in many ways that at first you're like, really? But I found myself in the first Wandering Earth, and with the prequel sequel, you get drawn into this story. It's a fascinating story, and I just love that they did a prequel, because when I watched Wandering Earth, the first one, they kind of sum up what basically happens in the prequel movie in the first 10 minutes. And I remember thinking that would have been really interesting. That's the whole story of how the world comes together and how they decide we're going to put 12,000, 13,000 engines on the Earth, and all the dynamics that would entail. I thought that would make a good story. And then sure enough, that's what they did. They said, let's expand that exposition they gave in the first movie and turn it into a 3-hour film explaining everything. And overall, I thought it was done pretty well.
Yeah, I agree with you. I mean, China's long had this kind of sort of reluctance to go all in on science fiction. Yeah, and
Mhm.
there are a number of reasons, we can speculate as to why, from technology to budgetary reasons to the fact that a lot of sci-fi, dystopian future
Yeah.
scenarios detail sort of, people unhappy with a state-run
Yeah.
kind
Yeah.
of country, and I think all of those have played a part
Yeah.
in there not being many sort
Yeah,
of
yeah.
sci-fi movies.
Sci-fi is often used as allegory for present day situations, as this film does.
Mm.
And I think China's maybe always been a little bit nervous about that.
Yeah, about sort of opening the door to sort of criticism, essentially,
Yeah.
because almost all of those allegories are sort of negative ones, just
Mhm.
about sort of societies where oppressive societies, essentially.
Yeah. Yeah.
What you've seen in recent years, however, obviously there's been a huge sort of domestically a huge boom in cinema, filmmaking, and what have you, and they have seen. And obviously just trends in blockbuster filmmaking have taken a huge swing towards
Mhm.
science fiction in the last sort of 20 years, and superhero movies and what have you, and huge use of CGI development is getting much better, it's getting cheaper, it's getting
Mhm.
sort of easier to tell these stories. But I think specifically in China, I think that the emergence of writers like Liu Cixin have been a big part of it,
Yeah.
and his success globally, I think has been recognized and tagged as a money-making opportunity,
Mhm.
quite frankly.
Yeah.
There are these stories where it's about individuals rising up against adversity in order to,
Yeah.
in order to save the world, essentially, create world-changing opportunities, which can tie in with the Chinese edict that
Yeah.
that big movies need to be propaganda tools. That's
Yeah.
not criticism. That's
Yeah.
just what's there
Yes.
in the
Yeah.
industry right now. All these big movies need to promote,
Mhm.
the positivity of a Chinese
Yeah.
way of life and all the
Yeah.
rest of it. But you can do that whilst also feeding into popular, popular storytelling.
And that's why, I enjoyed this, because there's certain propaganda moments that definitely raise their head in this film. And, and it's not unknown for an American film to
Oh,
raise, they fly the nationalistic flag. So this is not a criticism just at Chinese filmmaking at all. This is just an observation. But there's definitely a measure where, yes, the whole world has to come together. But when the Americans or the Russians wig out and they get nervous or they get spastic and they get crazy, you have calm, collect Chinese leader who will go to the front and
mhm.
give a very inspirational speech. And it was inspirational. The whole
We
thing
have
about
to stay the course. Yeah,
we
we've got
have,
to do it.
and the femur bone story anecdote that he gives, and how civilizations would help everyone around them 15,000 years ago. We have the first evidence of people coming together to help something that's broken, and now's our opportunity. I found myself getting inspired. It was a great speech, but there's definitely moments. Even I'm watching it, and Tammy's in the kitchen, and she hears the American in English going spastic, and she goes, "Couldn't they find an actor to give uh, the English lines in a reasonable, good acting way?" And I said, no, this is the
Mm.
Americans have to be slightly unhinged and off-centered in this film in order for it to pass muster.
Yeah, no, it's an interesting observation, and sadly there's a long history of bad Western acting in Asian
Yeah, yeah.
cinema. A lot of people were exposed to it for the first time watching Squid Game, the
Mhm.
Korean TV show on Netflix a year or so ago, where Western characters come into it late on and are just bad actors, and it's as simple as
Mhm.
that. In these recent Chinese movies, my understanding is that they use one dubbing company.
Mhm.
There's one very sort of a popular dubbing company that a lot of these big productions turn to, which is based in France, and so it's actually French actors putting on these accents, which is why if you look something like the Battle of Changjin or this movie,
Mm.
where it's bad acting, sure, the actors
Yeah.
on screen aren't the best, but then they're being overdubbed by overzealous perhaps even non-native speaker,
Second language English speakers.
voice
Yeah.
actors, so it just
Yeah.
exacerbates an already problematic situation. And I think that the Chinese filmmakers and all involved are totally cool with it, because yes, in these stories, it is the cool, calm, collected heads of our Chinese heroes
Mhm.
who win out, and
Yeah.
against the sort of the brash, impulsive, uh, sort of Westerners who don't go by the book, who are mavericks,
Yeah.
which is funny because a lot of the time we in our storytelling that's encouraged, to be
Right.
impulsive, to
Right.
take the risks, and whereas the tendency in some of these Chinese movies is to do the other, is go the other way, is to no
Mhm.
stick to the plan.
Right. Right.
Cool heads will prevail, and it proves to be the case in this case.
Yeah. I think one of the things I enjoyed about this film, and contrasting it a bit with a recent Hong Kong film that we did, we talked about Warriors of Future, was one of my critiques of that film was that the CGI just so completely eclipsed the storytelling that I felt like I was watching a video game. And whereas Wandering Earth 2 does have a lot of CGI, I never felt like it was at the expense of the story. I thought there was elements, granted at times it could be a little too melodramatic. Some of the things were carried on a little bit longer and with a little more drama than was necessary. But by and large, I was buying into the different tragedies that were unfolding in people's lives. Andy Lau's character, obviously losing his family and his young daughter being on a digital platform, and the argument about reality and the option of going and having a digital reality as an alternative to, let's blast the Earth into Alpha Centauri 2,500 years in the future,
Mm.
that they have a whole huge section of the populace that's saying that's absurd. Why don't we just use the technology to develop these online platforms, and we upload our digital selves and we live out a reality in our digital reality, and the arguments that go back and forth for that in the film. So yeah, there was aspects in this movie in Wandering Earth that were wonderful to watch and were in no means overshadowed by a rather abundant use of CGI.
Yeah, no, I think you kind of knew what you were getting into in this movie, that it was going to be very sort of CG heavy, but I don't think it really sort of detracted from the story. I think that there is a kind of inherent lack of tension and urgency in the second film because
Mm-hmm.
it's a prequel and because you know how things turn out. So it has to
Yeah.
build its thrills with sort of almost incidental action
Yeah.
sequences. Like there's the whole opening thing where they've got this space elevator that they're building and
Yes.
they're also
Yeah.
training the astronauts with, and that gets attacked by a fleet of drones controlled by a terrorist organization who are
Yeah.
promoting this digital life platform instead. And so then you get Wu Jing and the other pilots jumping in their fighter planes, and it all gets a little Top Gun
Yeah.
as they're
Yeah.
sort of zipping around, and that goes on for like pretty much about 45 minutes,
Yeah. Yeah.
a long period of the movie, and you're kind of like, okay, what has this got to do with anything?
Yeah. Yeah.
Not a great deal, but I did think it was interesting. What I found is that I found that the when I watched the first movie, it kind of fell into one of the very common problems with a lot of Asian science fiction outside of Japan. I think Japan is a kind of an anomaly here, where they've been doing science fiction for a very, very long time.
Right.
Their sort of inspiration and motivations for sci-fi come from a different place.
Mhm.
Whereas outside of Japan, it's been something. It hasn't been something that's been explored all that wildly. And what you're seeing recently in Chinese movies and Korean movies and TV shows a lot is essentially they're being inspired by big Hollywood blockbusters, and they're like, okay, well, I like that idea from that movie
Mhm.
and that idea from that movie and that set piece from that one, so let's just do those
Right.
and cobble it all together. And for me, the first Wandering Earth movie felt very much like that. It felt like a patchwork of,
Mhm.
Frank Guo, the director,
Yeah.
writer director, his favorite Hollywood
Scenes. Yeah.
scenes. Like
And
there's a lot of Armageddon in there, for
yeah. Yeah.
example. The second movie, I felt less of that. As I said, there's a
Mhm.
bit of Top Gun at the beginning, and then you get a little bit of Moonfall in the third act,
Yeah.
where they're like, the moon is literally going to
Yes.
crash. I was like, I'm pretty sure I saw a movie about this not too
Yeah.
long ago. But by and large, it's designed a position, or it's orchestrated a scenario where it can just pursue its own ideas, in a way that feels far more original and refreshing than in the first movie, which did feel very sort of derivative of a lot of better movies.
I agree. The sequel is a better film. This is a stronger film by and large. And I want to come back to a point you made earlier about you saying that sometimes some of the tension's lost because we know that certain characters are going to live or die, or what's going to happen. I remember joking, I made a little note that Wu Jing has to live saving everybody right now because he has to die saving everybody in the original film. So, but I did like the use of the title cards throughout the film to let you know at times that something bad was going to happen, and it was letting you know that something bad was going to happen. But not all. What was interesting is knowing something is going to happen, almost like we would in a prequel. But the story and the tension is, well, how is it going to unfold? How are we going to get from this point to there? Because we know at this point something bad's going to happen, or there's going to be some cataclysmic action or event that's going to occur. And I thought that the use of the title cards throughout the film actually added to the tension, knowing that they're all going to make it and they're all going to survive because they have to, because of the previous film. They give you these little vignettes of, okay, now there's going to be a little story that's going to unwrap to get to this cataclysmic decision or event, and I like the use of that. I found it very good filmmaking.
Yeah, no, I think that's a fair point. I think that is a fair point. I mean, sure, in most action movies, you're like, I know the hero is not going to die. He's going to be okay in the end, but that doesn't stop me fearing for his safety along the way, as it were. One of the other things that I thought was sort of derivative in the first film, but then paid off, if you like, in the prequel, was Wu Jing's got a kind of robot assistant, well, not a robot, but like an AI sentient computer up in his space station in the first movie. Called Moss, right? Is it called Moss in the first movie?
Yes.
And you see the origins of that character, and huge spoiler, it's Andy Lau essentially. Which is kind of sort of a big reveal, because Andy Lau is, he's a scientist and he's kind of in two minds. He's conflicted about the digital life platform because he's lost his family and his daughter is being kept alive on it, but he understands that this is not the solution. But then by the end of the movie, he's on it too, and it all gets uploaded into the computer, which and he then sort of assimilates with that and essentially becomes the computer. And I thought that was a really kind of cool bit of storytelling, because his motivations remain sort of in opposition, shall we say, to the Wandering Earth project. And now we kind of know why. He's not just a HAL ripoff.
And that's where we started to get into a little Black Mirror territory. I was seeing all kinds of little Black Mirror tropes being used. But quick question, does Andy Lau ever age? Because I swear that guy, whatever he's drinking or eating, can I order some? Because this guy does not age. And I just want to say,
he's the Chinese Paul Rudd, basically.
Yeah, he is the Chinese Paul Rudd. And I'm just such a fan, just knowing he was in this film, and he does a wonderful job. He lends gravitas to whatever film he's in. And I just want to say, I so enjoyed seeing Andy Lau Takhua in this movie.
I mean, he's the sort of the big ticket addition to this movie from the first one, and I think he does great. He kind of has his own thing going on, his own story, his own stakes. It's got to be quite daunting when you're being brought into a franchise where Wu Jing is already sort of the star. Wu Jing is such a huge action star in his own right,
and they never really interact in the film. Like they have two completely different storylines. Yeah.
With the irony of that being that in the sequel, the first movie, they're pretty much the only one. They only interact with each other.
Yeah.
Because in that movie he's on his own with his AI, which we now know is the mind of Andy Lau's character. It's fascinating, and I like the fact that it builds coherently to a big sort of third act showdown where Andy Lau is underwater in a submerged Beijing trying to hook up the network again while Wu Jing is out there, and you've got the suicide mission to the moon, and and it's a big payoff, and it all remains very, as I say, coherent. You know who's doing what, where, when, and it all has to coincide at the same time. I think it's fair to say Return of the Jedi kind of was the first movie to have this kind of sort of multi-tiered climax, if you like, where there was more than one thing going on at the same time. In that movie there were like three, and then George Lucas kind of upped it again and again and again, and that now it's become pretty standard. Particularly in like an Avengers movie where you've got so many characters, it's like, well, let's just have them off in groups doing different things simultaneously. But I'm pretty sure it was Return of the Jedi that kind of did it first.
It's a good observation. And just bringing it back to the suicide mission, I just thought there's so many elements in this, or so many times in this movie, where the premise, like, in order to set up a dramatic moment, we have to really just set any reality aside. Like, oh, sorry, all the launch sequences have gone offline. The only way we can do it is we have the hand crank on each one of them, basically. And who's going to volunteer? And of course, the Chinese squadron goes first. Every man over 50. And I thought, immediately, because we reviewed this show together, I thought immediately I would have to go on the suicide mission, Steve, and you would live, you bastard. And I thought, not over 50. Can we make it over 60? And I can.
But that was a good moment. I mean, it does bring me to one criticism, however, which is I think the women are rather poorly served in this movie, and I think with the exception of is it Hao Xiaoxi, who Manzi's character, who's the sort of the assistant or executive assistant, or executive to the assistant to the executive, to the Chinese defense minister, who was very right. His number two, she does okay, but I think other than her, almost every other female character in the movie is there to die to motivate the men to do their job better. Whether it's Wu Jing's wife dying of cancer, or it's Andy Lau's entire family all dying, just to spur him on. And you realize, and it dawned on me in that third act moment where the astronauts or whatever they are start volunteering to do the suicide mission, and then you get the older guy, the friend, Wu Jing's mate, and he's like, oh no, this is something. This is something that we need to do as the older generation. And he pushes him aside. He's like, no, all guys over 50. And you realize, oh, okay, so actually in every story strand, this is a movie about fathers making sacrifices for their children, essentially. It's the older generation stepping aside, paving the way for the younger generation. And you know what, for a Chinese movie, that's a pretty progressive perspective, because I found, both of us, we've lived in Hong Kong for decades, and one of the and everyone always asks me, well, what's the difference between Western culture and Chinese culture, which obviously is an unanswerable question, but one of the simplest observations that I will often point out is that, in my experience, Western civilization is very forward thinking, and I don't want this to sound negative, but forward thinking, whereas Chinese culture is very backward thinking. Now, what I mean is not backward thinking, but it's about respecting your elders, respecting your ancestors. It's about looking back into history, and everything you do is to service the older generation. Whereas in Western culture, it's all about for the future, for the children.
Right.
So it was interesting to see this movie where it was very much about for the future, for the children, rather than young people doing something for their ancestors,
which is the overall arching theme of Wandering Earth, because this is all 100 generations down the road, and this is all being done for some unforeseen future, 2,500 years in the future. I mean, what kind of technology do they have, and can they speed up the Earth at some point? Who knows? But this is all such a grandiose project for the time immortal in the future, that I will argue, though, you were saying this could only be a prequel because they couldn't do anything going forward. And I thought, actually, going forward, they should turn this into a TV series, because once they start moving out of the solar system, there's all kinds of character-driven plots you could have on this Earth, and you could have a generation. One season is, a certain segment of time, and then season 2, it's 100 years in the future. And what have they done? They're leaving the solar system now, and then they go, season 3 is 500 years in the future, and they've developed, they can do this, but they can't do this, and they're running out of that. I kept thinking, this needs to be a TV show going forward, because you've got basically 2,500 years to get there.
It would be like a sort of Chinese version of For All Mankind, the Apple TV show, where it starts off with a space race, but very quickly turns into sort of sci-fi. No, you're absolutely right. You've got they've set it up from the beginning. You've got 2,500 years worth of journey ahead of you. And obviously there's a lot of sort of TV precedents for that. Obviously Star Trek's 5-year mission that just went on and on and on and on, Lost in Space and what have you, anything like that. The only other thing I wanted to point out is obviously, this is a huge planet-sized allegory for climate change, but I felt that particularly in the first act as well, there's a bit of a COVID thing going on in there as well. Because you have these sort of violent deniers of what's happening. To the point of violence, where they're willing to sort of blow things up rather than take the safe precautions necessary. And it does kind of reflect not only sort of the foolishness of the COVID deniers from the early days, but also China's kind of tried and tested, or seemingly tried and tested sort of zero COVID approach. It's like, no, we're just going to do this. Just stick with it. Go with it.
Stick with the plan.
Stick with the plan. And it's going to take a long time, and people are going to get frustrated, but you got to stick with the plan. Stick with the plan, and it will work. I mean, it didn't work, but stick with the plan and it will work. So I definitely sort of noticed that in there. But there's also just a couple of other interesting things where there does seem to be sort of definite and deliberate pushback in the movie about an over-digitized society, which I thought was interesting, because in many ways China actually is one of the most digitized societies. It's almost entirely cashless in almost every city and what have you now. And also there is and it's never really addressed. I mean, I suppose it's foreshadowing for the first film, the sequel, is that it repeatedly holds focus on surveillance cameras.
Yes.
Throughout the movie, there are just shots of surveillance cameras. Somebody somewhere is watching.
Is watching you.
Is watching you and watching everything. They're not doing anything about it, but they're watching. And this is something that has been of some sort of concern in China as well, just that, the surveillance and the over surveillance of the people and what have you. And so I thought that those elements were interesting to have included in something that is so obviously a very mainstream government approved Chinese movie. It's merely interesting because nothing gets past the censors.
No.
In a big Chinese mainstream movie. So everything that's there has been given the okay many times. And so it's interesting when you see things in there that can still be perceived as essentially critical of today's world. And I think, dare I say, that it's an encouraging step forward. And I think by and large, I think my final point on the movie is that it shows a very encouraging step forward for sci-fi in general in China, where
Agreed.
it hasn't been only really a recent.
Well, James, as we draw this to a close, obviously we need an instrument of measure to rank and review and score Wandering Earth 2. What are we going to do? What's going to be our, how many what?
Digitized children?
I was going to say how many space elevators?
Okay, yeah. I'm trying to think of inanimate objects that are prominently in the movie. But there's the little thing that Andy Lau carries around his neck, which is his daughter. Like
like how many digitized daughters,
digitized children,
thumb drives.
Yeah.
How many daughters on a thumb drive do you?
There you go.
James, how many digital daughters on a thumb drive are you going to give Wandering Earth 2?
Okay. Well, I mean, it is, as I just said, it is a very encouraging step forward for mainstream Chinese blockbuster cinema and science fiction in general, and how it is being explored and discussed in China. I mean, it's still a big dumb sort of derivative movie. It's less so than beforehand, and I think it actually attempts to have some sort of serious discussion. As you mentioned before, it's long and unwieldy. I mean, this is a 3-hour movie, and feels equally invested in all its family melodrama as in its bombastic spectacle. And I feel that a number of the characters are poorly served by that. But no, this was big. This was big and fun and entertaining. And I'm already a fan of Frank Woe's cinema, and this might be the moment I finally sit down and read The Three-Body Problem, which I've been putting off for way too long. So I'm going to give it a big, rock solid 3 children on a thumb drive.
Again, say this is a superior film to Wandering Earth, the original film. This is stronger. The addition of Andy Lau adds a gravitas to it. Again, there's a little too much melodrama for me, and for some of the critiques you mentioned, what this film could have used is a little more time in the editing room. 20 minutes off at least could have made this a tighter script. There was too many scenes that just kind of went on forever, and there still is a measure too, even though this is definitely a advancing and a further step in science fiction in China, as you mentioned. There is still a little too much of trying to just take the tropes of successful Western blockbusters and imprint them into basically a Chinese story. And I think there needs to be more original Chinese-ness that infuses Chinese movies as original as many non-science fiction Chinese movies do so well. There seems to be an element whenever they go blockbuster, they're maybe not secure enough to just make their own blockbuster. It still feels like a patchwork of part Chinese, part Western. And I think there's still quite a few steps to move forward. Having said that, though, I really enjoyed this and I recommend it highly. You gave it 3, just to not be giving the same. And because I can give halves, I'm going to give it 3.5, because nice. I enjoyed this film. And well done to Frank Wall for making a wonderful prequel movie. Well, that's what we thought, James and I, about The Wandering Earth 2. What do you think? Do we give an accurate review and a score? Do you feel we were fair? Do you think we had some criticisms that are unjust, or do you think we were overly generous? Let us know in the comment boxes below. James?
Yeah, let us know some of your other favorite Chinese sci-fi movies and books. I mean, Liu Cixin is on my radar. Haven't read any of his stuff yet, but I'm edging closer to doing so. But who else's work should we be paying attention to right now? If you know, by all means, let us know.
Till next episode. Bye-bye.
You're wonderful to see.